The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee. As he was entering a village, 10 persons with leprosy met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." As they were going, they were cleansed. And one of them, realizing he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice. And he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were cleansed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God? Then he said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
We're praying with the people of God this morning who are joining us by live stream here at Mount Assisi. I know many Province of the Most Sacred Heart of Jesus benefactors are joining us at Mass this morning. Members of our St. Francis University community are also joining us. We have a lot to give thanks for, even in the midst of this pandemic. I wasn't going to make this quip because, again, it's too soon, but the story of the 10 lepers shows that social distancing is not a new thing, and that there were sicknesses even prior to today. I'm sorry, I know it was too soon, but the outcome is a good one. The lepers are healed, and one of them has the common courtesy to go back and give thanks and sing gratitude to God. As we reflect on the year, it is good to give thanks, even in the midst of a pandemic, and even for us, especially for us, to realize that the grace of God is at work even when it might not seem to be. St. Paul, in one of his earliest letters, in his letter to the Thessalonians, St. Paul exhorts the early Christians to rejoice always, to pray without ceasing, and in all things to give thanks. Now, when he gave that exhortation, he wrote that to a discouraged Christian community. They were a small band to begin with. They believed in this thing called the resurrection. They thought Christ would come again in their lifetimes. But as early Christians were passing away, they realized that that was not to be, and it was shaking the faith of some and causing discouragement. They put their lives on the line for this belief, but Paul says to them in all that, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and in all things give thanks." I suppose Paul could have said, pray a little bit more, or try to be more grateful. But in typical St. Paul fashion, he goes right for the max. Goes right to the max. And he can't help that, because St. Paul himself had an encounter with the risen Christ that changed everything. So Paul had to go to extreme in prayer and thanksgiving and enthusiasm, because the risen Christ changed everything. When he says to rejoice always, this could sound over the top, particularly in a time of persecution for early Christians, in a time of pandemic for current Christians, even in the midst of sadness and tragedy. St. Paul says, rejoice always. St. Paul is not saying to be on some spiritual high or some emotional high. What he's saying is the risen Christ brings us the victory. The victory is universal. Nothing in this world can undo the victory of the risen Christ. So in that, we're called to rejoice always. No failure, no sin, no pandemic, not anything can overcome Christ's victory. Therefore, there is always cause for rejoicing. St. Paul tells us to pray without ceasing. That can be a tall order. There's a lot of other things to do during the day, basic functions, eating and sleeping. But St. Paul says to pray without ceasing. At the heart of that exhortation, we're reminded that Christ has come to us so that we can have a relationship with God. Every single baptized Christian participates in the divine life. The prayer is our awareness of the relationship with God. Prayer is as basic, therefore, as breathing. We are aware of our relationship with God, always be it prayer. In all things, give thanks. And yes, on Thanksgiving Day, we are called to count our blessings. And we're reminded, too, that by Christ's stripes, we were healed. So in this day and age, when we see sin and suffering, sickness and sadness, we have the opportunity to see those as the grace of God at work. Terrible moments in society, terrible moments in our lives are transformed by the risen Christ. In all things, give thanks. We partake this morning of a sacred banquet, and for most people later today, there will be another banquet of sorts around the family table. As we gather around this sacred altar for the sacred banquet, we're reminded of many sacred meals that have taken place in the course of salvation history, and we read of them in Scripture. There was the infamous meal of Adam and Eve. There's the meal that is foreshadowed by Isaiah, the banquet that takes place on God's holy mountain, the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, and finally, the Last Supper. At these sacred meals that we read of in Scripture and at the sacred meal that we partake in today, God unites us in peaceful, life-giving, holy communion with himself. And so as you gather around your table today, and as we gather around our table, let's let that gathering be a reflection of the sacred banquet, one that is peaceful, one that is joyful, one at which there is thanksgiving. As St. Paul says, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and in all things give thanks.